Good morning. Please turn with me to. I did it again. So. Good morning. Thank you. Appreciate it. Please turn with me to 1 Thessalonians, the first chapter. 1 Thessalonians, the first chapter. And as we are finishing up, really, our discussions on 1 Thessalonians, the first chapter, isn't typically where I would start. But this is going to be more of a comprehensive lesson under the heading Exemplary. Exemplary. And why exemplary today? Because we have talked about Paul's prison epistles being somewhat distinct from his initial epistles in the letters to the Romans, the Galatians, and the Corinthians, being these are more progressive voices, not in the political sense, but he is able to take the foundation of love that he has in each of these churches to whom he is writing, and he's able to build off of that foundation and help develop a unique gift, it seems, that each of these congregations has. In the letter to the Ephesians, he was able to take their love and build on their insight. Similarly, in the letter to the Colossians, the Philippians will look at the fact that he was able to give more of an insight into his ministry and open up a little bit more of his life as an apostle, where he shows that even though as Christians we're called to love big, we don't always get a lot of that love in return. And part of our ability to cope and deal with the stresses of life is understanding how to love big, even though sometimes you receive small rewards. Goes along with what Brian was talking about when he was talking about how is it that Paul is able to stay encouraged in a prison or under a beating. A lot of our ability to run with endurance has everything to do with our perspective on our situation. And that is what we're seeing in each of these congregations who are building on an established foundation of love. 1 Thessalonians, we said it's only the first time he writes them because much like 1 Corinthians, he broaches some issues that he's going to have to bring up again. We talked about it on Wednesday night. There are times when we have to deal with delicate issues with one another. We want to be gentle, but gentle simply opens the door. Sometimes it doesn't always close the matter. And so he has to write back in 2 Thessalonians dealing with some issues like idleness in particular we talked about, and also trying to comfort hearts about the day of the Lord. And we talked about that in class this morning, right? We have some events where we can be tempted to go one of two ways, either to completely tune them out as I had done early on in the week, not really paying attention to any of the news because I'm like, I don't want to be too alarmed. Or we can swing to the other side and look at them and see the last days coming upon us tomorrow, if that's what we want to see. But in the middle, Paul is telling us the ways in which we can practically look at these things, not ignoring them, but not making too much of the signs either, so that we can understand how we can pragmatically adjust our lives to changing times. And what we're seeing in the church of Thessalonica is a church whose love is not allowing them necessarily the intellectual insight that a Ephesus might have had, but because they were a church that was planted in adversity, they are simply showing us how to stand up under pressure. And that's one of the most important things. Why? Because if this church was not grounded in love, there's no telling what the external pressure might have done to them. But ultimately what we see is they are able to thrive and even grow under adversity. And starting in chapter 1, we see Paul giving us some indications of this very thing. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 2. We give thanks to God always for all of you, constantly mentioning you in our prayers, remembering before our God and Father your work of faith and labor of love and steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. For we know, brothers loved by God, that he has chosen you because our gospel came to you not only in word, but also in power and in the Holy Spirit and with full conviction. You know what kind of men we proved to be among you for your sake. And you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit, so that you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. For not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything, for they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to walk for his son from heaven. And to wait for his son, from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. Understand a few things beginning in verse 6. This is a church that was willing to be imitators of the tradition. See, there are all kinds of traditions we can pick up, but there is a proverb that says, one who walks with the wise will himself or herself become wise. And so it's important to understand what traditions are we falling into, and that is one of the reasons why this church may be distinguished from others in his initial address to them in the letter, because they picked a healthy example. And so having picked a healthy example and started from that foundation, he's not having to fix as much. This is like we talked about in terms of how home building. I used the example before. If the foundation is properly laid, it changes your whole peace of mind in that house, not having to deal with cracks running up the wall years later. And so that's what we're seeing here. Part of the spiritual foundation of this congregation is picking the right people to emulate. Why? Because that was the only example they had? No. They had other options of different people to follow. Why? Because they were being pressured early on not to follow Paul. And the second thing to understand there is not every win in your life is going to look like a win. We've talked about it before, but this is different. Why? Because why is Paul writing back? Part of it is he was anxious about how this church was doing because he didn't really get to stay and see how it finished up, right? And so ultimately he says he sends Timothy, even though Timothy was very valuable to him. How do we know? Because we talked about it from the letter to Philippi. When he was sending all that love out, there were very few people he could trust. Timothy was one of them. We talked about Epaphras, who was another person, effective in the very foundation of this congregation. And so ultimately, he's sending someone who's valuable to him in a situation where he doesn't have any valuable relationships because he cares so much about what happened, and he didn't have time to stay because they chased him out of town, right? But the seed was already planted. What does that mean for your life? There are going to be times when your wins look like an L because you've either been chased out of town or things just didn't finish up in the timeline you expected. Talked about the mission field. I didn't expect to ever come back to America, but 3 years later, I was headed back to America. And so some of those seeds that were planted ended up growing, and I had to be encouraged by seeing the growth that happened without me being there. Why? Because just as Paul said with the dispute in Corinth between he and Apollos, it's not me or Apollos, it's me doing what I do, Apollos doing what he does, and God getting the increase because he's the one that adds the true blessing to the labor. And so that is in many ways what he's taking comfort in here and showing us how we can take comfort. It's not always God's blessing showing up in our best gifts shining forward, because sometimes we're just in situations where our best gifts aren't going to be able to shine through. And the example that we're setting is our simple ability to survive. And so even though that may seem like it's not enough, because we know what we have the potential to do. I told you about one of the most intelligent kids I ever worked with was a kid who was raising his little brother as functional orphans. And one of the things that honed his intellect was the fact that he was having to function as an adult from first grade. And so that kid could have been in somebody's Ivy League school if he was raised in the right environment. But his skills were honed in learning to eat and find shelter and eventually make up all the time he had lost in school when given the opportunity. See, sometimes that's going to be our lives as well. There are going to be some things where we have the potential to fully fulfill an opportunity, but we're not going to be planted in the right environment. And it can create pain, it can create regret, it can create remorse if we don't understand that God has something in us that may not necessarily be for the full development of that gift. It may simply be to encourage other people who are in a similar situation, other people who won't be planted in environments where they can make the most of their gifts. Other people who are planted in situations where they just aren't able to do everything they could have done if they had an even shot. And so sometimes I'm planted in that situation as a first, even if I might not see it. Someone who God is simply asking to survive the difficult times. See, Thessalonica couldn't necessarily thrive like an Ephesus that was noted for both its love and the way that its love manifested itself in deep wisdom and insight. Similarly, in a Colossians or Colossae, that was the manifestation. They were allowed deeper spiritual wisdom and insight because they were rooted in a love that helped them to understand a lover in Jesus Christ, right? But in Thessalonica, sometimes it's simply your ability to be tough in difficult circumstances, like our brother talked about. Sometimes it's just people, no matter how much they know about your resume, Paul, seeing how you stand up in prison. Sometimes it's not so much people understanding how much you've given up as a former Pharisee and leader of that group. It's helping them see how you can endure under the same punishment, as our brother said, that you lashed out against a Stephen. And so when they see that, yes, you did it out of maybe a misguided desire to serve God, when they can see that even though you dished it out in the wrong way or in the wrong mindset, you at least have the character to endure the very same thing. That can help encourage others who are trying to overcome. Why? Because it's like we've said, raise your hand if you're perfect. Yeah, exactly. That's the time we know, no response. That's good. Because we're all going to have to overcome something. And it helps us to see how a person who has been publicly shamed can overcome and still give glory to God in the way that they take advantage of their second chance. And that's what you're seeing in Paul. See, so Paul can give us an example of what it's both like to be an exceptional scholar and thrive intellectually, having hopefully begun to perfect his love for the Lord, and to be tough in difficult circumstances. And in each of these churches, we're seeing different pieces of what we're actually seeing out of Paul and his own character. And in many ways, why it's effective when Paul says, imitate me. Why? Just because I'm me? No. Imitate me as I imitate Christ, right? So he's saying, as a man who is not perfect, there are some things out of my character or out of my walk you're going to want to ignore. But hopefully what I'm doing is setting an example that more than anything shows you that the things I got right, I'm giving glory to God about. But the things I got wrong, I got at least the character to stand up under the same things I dished out. And that requires prayer, because it's not always easy. See, it's a lot easier for me to dish it out than it is for me to take it. Why? Because I'm just looking at it from my perspective as the disher. And as the disher, I don't always understand the perspective of the taker. But when God seats me in that seat, that's when character starts to show. And I pray that when I'm in the seat of the taker, that God can strengthen me. One, to have the good sense to at least have a little mercy when I'm in the disher seat, so that then he can have the mercy to help me withstand the day when I'm in the taker seat. And so that is what we were looking at here in the church at Thessalonica. A perfect group of Christians? No, but Christians whose example is shown not so much in what they accomplished as much as it is in what they survived. They survived. So when we look down in verse 1 of chapter 2, continuing on, you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain, but though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. Understand this as well. Endurance. One of the reasons why he talks about running with endurance was this isn't the first time Paul had to deal with hard times. He had been in jail in Philippi. Now he's going to Thessalonica. And this is the second missionary journey. Why? On the first missionary journey, everything went well? No. We talked about it before. He was literally stoned, and that's when he got a chance to experience some of what he had participated in the life, or the end of the life of Stephen. And so what we're seeing is a person who, in addition to saying run with endurance, he's showing us how to endure over time, because we've talked about it before. It's one thing for me to be able to deal with an adversity. It's another thing for me to be able to deal with a couple of adversities. But it's another thing to have the mindset to allow me to run with endurance. Wave after wave after wave of difficulty. And that's what we're seeing in Paul. Someone who has fixed his mind to both, like he said, I've learned in every situation how to both abound, whether I have much or have little, right? But in every situation to be able to find contentment. And so in these stories, if we're really connecting the letters and the epistles back to what we read about Paul's life in the Acts, we're seeing these tidbits of wisdom lived out in his actual experience. And so many of the best lessons, when we start to see that consistency between external projection and internal character, a lot of it comes from not a study that is then lived out. It is what we call, like Jesus said in Matthew chapter 12, from the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. In Paul's life, it seems like a lot of what we're seeing is a man who is speaking out of the abundance of his experience, out of the depth of his suffering. And the suffering doesn't matter if you don't really overcome. You don't become exemplary unless you learn how to overcome suffering. And that's what we're seeing both in Paul's life and in the Thessalonians. See, we all have suffering in common in some degree. The overcoming is what makes exemplary. And so that's what we get to see in the church at Thessalonica. Also understand this, even though it might have seemed like the war was won initially on behalf of the authorities who ran Paul out of town, what happened was they actually, and this is a war metaphor, they spread their forces too thin. So as they were chasing Paul from town to town, as we've talked about, they were like, "Get out, Paul, we got him, we still got him on the run." They weren't paying attention to the fact that the seed that he planted was doing pretty well. And so even though these folks still had to deal with persecution, the fact that they were splitting their forces means they didn't have enough concentration in either place. Guess why? Because Paul won and the Thessalonians won. Paul carried on and continued planting churches and doing work. The Thessalonians continued to develop one of the stronger congregations we see an epistle written to. And so because of the fact that the enemy didn't pay careful enough attention to either one, and the bottom line is no matter how much attention the enemy pays, if God is in it, it's going to grow anyway. And we get to see an example of how the enemy miscalculates. And so that is one of the times where we have to always take comfort in that even though we might not see the growth that we want to see in a church plant, Thessalonica, God is still working. And so Paul isn't writing in vain when he's writing to Corinth and saying, look, I planted, Apollos watered, whichever word that goes in, but God gets the increase. That's a survival mentality, because understanding that mentality in Corinth helps him get through being chased out of Thessalonica. And even though he's anxious enough to send Timothy back, he's not anxious enough to be lost in despair. How does that apply to us? It's obvious, right? When we look at those times, when we look at some of these scriptures, it just seem like that's a nice thing to think about. Sometimes it's important to deeply remember it, whether it's a memory verse, however you got to get it down into your heart. You got to get down into your heart the things that these members, these first century Christians went through, because these are the tools for overcoming present day adversities. And so when we see the different types of things that were thrown at them, the different circumstances that they were in, the reason why understanding these stories is so important. It's just like understanding your family history, right? You go back and sometimes your family history, it can just be for family reunion time. But there are times when understanding your family history gives you a depth of understanding of why we do things today the way that we do them, or why we struggle in certain areas the way that we do. And so understanding your family history can give you the context for health and for moving forward in a healthy way. This is our family history. And that's why it's important to begin to understand the things that we need to understand about what these people went through. Because if we are these people, then Satan, I'm not special enough for him to create something new. A lot of times he's not going to reinvent the wheel on what he throws at Marcus. He's got other things to do. And so he's simply going to use his cookie cutter approach on a guy like me, the one that he developed on guys like me way back when. And so the more I understand about how they overcame, the more I can intuitively in the moment, as we've talked about before, respond in the right way when I'm actually under pressure. As we've talked about it before, it's easy to do and easy to respond when I got time to look it up. But when I'm in the moment, that is when I find myself in tough situations, having to use the best of my, not necessarily mental discretion, but the best of what has been wired into me. And they call it muscle memory. I'll take one. It's my sports analogy. Muscle memory is that thing that gets you from knowing the right thing to do to intuitively reacting and doing the right thing. It's the thing that I practice so much, and people say muscle memory isn't a real thing. Probably isn't, but practice is, and conditioning is as well. And so what we have commonly called muscle memory is that level of practice that makes success effortless. And so the reason why I say that is because, well, I'm going into it, but pick up and trying to, the way I try to minister with the kids on campus is one way where you not only have a physical activity that gives you the opportunity to interact with younger folks, right? But The physical activity really is simply a platform for hopefully being able to have some substantial conversations, even if they never show up. And so the muscle memory has to be twofold. One, you got to be able, under pressure, old man, to keep up with young men, right? Because you know all the right stuff to do, but they're just quicker than you, right? And the less conditioned you are to do the right thing in the right circumstance, the more you're just going to look like you need to find the old man's court, right? So if you're going to at least have enough respect for them to have mercy on you and let you run with them, then if you don't want the effort to be in vain, you got to have hopefully enough sense to pray to God for the right thing to say in the right moment, because a wise answer comes from God. And then two, to be conditioned to try to use a social friendship for a higher spiritual purpose. And so the more we're conditioned to talking to people in everyday circumstances, the more our muscle memory, both in the physical and mental and spiritual realms, kind of come together to make our opportunities look like what I think I remember Jesus saying in the Great Commission: go into all the world, make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Spirit, teaching them to observe everything that I command you. That whole part of going all the world, it actually more or less translates into as you are going. So it's not like a Great Commission, just like he's sending his apostles on a mission. It's as they are going about their lives, learn how to make the most out of every opportunity. And that is one of the other reasons why having goodness and righteousness and mercy and all of the things that feed into the love that he's called us to do, hardwired in our character, it's why it's so important. See, because the Thessalonians didn't talked about Titus and Nadine not giving us a permission slip before leaving. We thought they might have been leaving, right? Trouble doesn't give you notice or advance permission slip. When this is, not to go too deeply into what we talked about in class, one of the things you're hearing from people on the streets in Russia, they didn't think the Ukraine they were gonna invade the Ukraine. And then the one thing they have in common on the other side in the Ukraine, they didn't think they were gonna get invaded. Is this brand new? No. This has been going on for a while. The threats back and forth, not really back and forth, but the vying for power across that border is not a new thing. I looked at a video this morning and talked about an 8-year history of this current situation. But also the fact that they were caught off guard. And take that as a lesson to us. We are, as we talk about the difference between earthquakes and tremors, this doesn't have to get it lodged in our minds as a potential Armageddon earthquake. We can pay attention to whether or not it's a tremor and realize the degree to which what's going on in the Ukraine more and more defines our reality here in the United States. Because I will say this one thing, is that we are no longer in a position where we can simply gather forces together and go fight a war, even for good purposes, because we're spread so thin. Now, in situations where we ordinarily would have learned from history and simply stepped in militarily, it's just not clear we can do that anymore. And so one of the things that's being displayed right now, more than anything else, is the limits of power, at least here. And the more power begins to level out, the more our lives are going to start to look like people in other parts of the world. And the more our lives start to look less like what we're accustomed to and more like what other folks are used to in places where their militaries can't always make right happen, the more we need to start opening up our perspective on what a Thessalonican reality really is, right? Because the less we're going to be able to rely on the old realities of, well, we're over here and they're over there. And the more we're going to have to start looking at, well, what is uncertain times that come upon us in a hurry? What does that look like? COVID much? Regardless of your perspective on what it was, did you plan for that one? Yeah, exactly. Neither did I. Right? And so more and more, it's not even a year or two passing between these events where we are collectively more like the rest of the world, being caught off guard. That is one of the ways that humanity is leveling out. And one of the reasons why we talk about the Revelation in conjunction with books like Thessalonica or Thessalonians that talk about end times is because they talk about what it's like to be able to adjust in increasing uncertainty. And so that's what we're seeing in Thessalonica. More than anything, more than simply being able to strive or thrive in those times, the thing that we can take joy in no matter how difficult the times get is that if we have a perspective that's larger than our own, God willing, we start praying now for whether or not hard times come to us in different forms in these shores or not, that we are prepared to stand like a Thessalonica, to stand like, even though when you get to the Revelation where Jesus is writing his letter to the 7 churches, one of the churches he notes is, you have your seat near, your church is planted, or you're working near Satan's seat. So I understand the hardships that you're enduring. Whether we're seated all the way on the other end of the spectrum from adversity, or we're seated right next to it. Our prayer is that in hopefully in good times, that we can let go, like Brian touched on, of the mentality that we can only perform and pray for the peace, understanding that in a lot of ways, when God snatches or allows peace to be snatched away from us, that is when we are really shown to possibly, I'm going to use a cheesy metaphor, but shine brighter. If I light a candle in this room in the middle of the daylight, how's it going to shine? You might see it. I shut the lights off. You've heard the illustration before. In the middle of the night, that candle is going to shine brighter. You might look at the candle and be like, why you got that candle up there? We got lights in the middle of the day. But the power goes out in the middle of the night, and you start understanding why it's important for that candle to be able to shine, right? The parable of the 10 virgins, right? The 5 wise, and then the 5 other, right? The fact that they had their lamps prepared in any circumstance is the illustration that God gave us for how we should be as people as we look forward. Because there's a time when the groom is going to come back, right? Whether it's in our own personal death or in times that collectively require us to shine in collectively dark times. Bottom line for everybody is we got to be prepared. And so here's the thing that Paul is talking about when he's writing letters like this, and Jesus is going back and giving those 7 reports to those churches in the Revelation. The admonition to be ready is linked to the wisdom that it takes to be exemplary. And so we look often at those 2 churches that got no rebuke in the Revelation. And like, man, wouldn't you like to be that church that got no rebuke? Do you really want to be that poor church that was deprived, that was wanting to quit, was so beaten down they were ready to give up? It would be that other church that was starting to doubt itself because of all the adversity it was trying to stand up under. Those were the 2 churches that stood in dark times. And so now, if we are going to be that kind of people, it takes adjusting to that kind of mentality. And passages like Acts 2, when they shared all things in common, start looking a lot less silly in terms of, really? They shared all things in common? And then as we approach the end times and you start seeing the things that are written there, that's more like a survival skill as opposed to, just an interesting thing to note in Acts chapters 2 and 4. So the only reason I'm writing these things is saying these things is understanding what Paul has written, that being exemplary, we've already talked about it, goes hand in hand with adversity. But we're at a time now where if we've never done it before, it's probably good to reevaluate our sense of normalcy in relation to what was biblically normal for people in the first century. And so maybe as we go forward, we look at letters to Thessalonians as they end Paul's prison epistles. As we go forward in this mentality of, okay, what would what did the church actually look like in its days of adversity? How much does that really relate to us now? Now we're going to start to see how he counsels his leaders, people who he's left behind, people who he can trust to help grow works that he can't oversee personally, as we're going to move into looking at 1 Timothy and Titus. Maybe take that same mentality or attitude. Okay, what do we look like, or what does being exemplary look like as a congregation as we look at what being exemplary looks like in the life of Paul's trusted associates? And so with that, I definitely don't have a tidy bow to put on the lesson this week. I think I preached a little shorter than usual. I'm not sure. Sorry. Hopefully that's a gift to our visitors. Thank you. But I know it's no more well organized. But sometimes the times are just like that. I told folks today in class, the lesson that I had for class was completely different than the one I actually preached. By the time I left the building on Friday, I kept watching the news, and the news just pretty much demanded that I change course. So just with that, I like to have them a little bit more tidy, but my admonition to you is this: as we close Paul's prison epistles, understand as you go back through them in your personal time of study, how these are lessons that can help you understand how to set an example even when you don't have all the resources you think you would have needed to have reached your personal potential. Because it's not about my personal potential. It's about the unique lesson God is trying to teach other people in my situation through sometimes my mere ability to simply survive difficulty. So my prayer for you is my prayer for me. We can take joy in the prayer that we heard from our sister Chelsea. And she didn't necessarily know how her father's outlook was going to be about a week ago. And a week later, we can say, praise God for the fact that she's had good news in that situation. We talked about one of the other things that helps us overcome adversity. I didn't want to repeat from Wednesday, but the more we learn to find genuine joy in the successes of one another, the more we can steal joy in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's okay to steal. If I'm happy for you, Brian, hopefully it's okay that I steal a little bit of your joy if I'm in a relatively dark time. Same thing for each and every one of us. When you're in your dark times, hopefully you feel it's okay to steal joy from other brothers and sisters who have gotten good news, because that's another survival skill that he's teaching these churches. We learn to steal joy, the things that are okay to steal. We talked about being stubborn in a good thing. One of the reasons why it's important to learn how to love is so that we can learn how to share each other's happiness when we're individually not being able to appreciate it. So with that, I appreciate each of you individually being patient. God bless.